This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace. Here in the Northern Hemisphere, we've entered those cold, dark winter months. And in fact, just a month ago, the clocks went back, which meant that the sun's now setting at around 4 p.m. and there's a lot less light to play with out there during the day for street photography. But there's no excuse to sit and hibernate. I mean, yes, it's true that bright summer sun that I like, that kind of overhead direction that casts those deep shadows, that sort of light won't be around for months yet. But there's a different sort of light that I like to chase in these dark winter months, and it's the artificial light of our cities at night. After all, light is light, and in the absence of that natural light that we like to play with in the summer, there is no reason that we can't be going out into our cities and instead using the man-made multicolored lighting that we have available to tell really interesting visual stories. So at this time of year, especially when a lot of our cities have Christmas lights going up, which add even more lighting to our streets, I thought I'd make a really practical video and take you onto the streets of London and show you some of the rules I work by when making street photography images at night. Okay, so let's talk about settings. A lot of photographers say to me, well, I don't shoot at night because I don't like high ISOs because it makes my images really noisy. But you don't need high ISOs to shoot at night. Honestly, when I'm shooting in scenes like this at night, I very, very rarely go above ISO 800. Maybe 1600 at a push, but on modern cameras, that's still going to give you a pretty clean image. The fact is, I'm always exposing, like I do during the day, for the highlights, and I'm letting my shadows full dark in the frame. I'm not walking down dark alleyways to try to get shots because the lighting down there is going to be very low, but it's also probably going to be very flat and even and not that interesting. So if you're exposing for your lighting and looking for those pockets of lights to create interesting images, you don't actually need a high ISO. So in this case, I'm shooting on manual so I can control my settings and I can actually expose for the light sources that I want. I'm on ISO 800. I'm on f1.8. The thing is with night photography, you're going to need a faster prime. You're going to need something where you can open that aperture wide up. And I've got a 50mm 1.2, which is a gorgeous lens for nighttime. But I knew if I used it in this video, a lot of people would say, well, that just proves you need a super expensive lens to be able to do this. So instead, I'm using actually one of my favorite lenses is this Zeiss 55mm, and it only goes to 1.8, but that's still plenty to be able to do this sort of photography at night. And in any camera range, no matter what brand you use, there will be a 50mm equivalent lens that goes to 1.8 and it will usually be fairly affordable. So take a look at what you can grab a hold of. So I'm opening the aperture wide up to 1.8. I've got ISO 800 and now I'm just exposing for my light sources with my shutter speed, that third point on the exposure triangle, and 1/100, 1/80 of a second is absolutely fine. My lighting looks good, my shadows look dark, and I'm exposing for those bright lights. And that's why I don't use aperture priority, because I don't want the camera changing my shutter speed without me knowing what it's doing or being able to pay attention to it. Because if I go too slow, that third point of the exposure triangle, the shutter speed, is going to affect movement in the shot. And I don't want blurry images unless it's on purpose, where I want to capture movement or something. I want sharp, clean images. So the basic rule you want to follow is to make sure those images are sharp at night. Your shutter speed should never be slower than your focal length. And by that I mean, for example, if I'm shooting with a 50mm lens, I should never be slower than 1/50th of a second. If I go down to 1/4 of a second, I'm going to start to get shake and blurry images. So I need to be 1/50th or above. If you're shooting with a 100mm lens, you should be 1/100th of a second or faster to make sure your images are clean and sharp. But now that I've got the settings in the camera, I can just go around, I can use this and just dial that shutter speed. That's what I'm going to be changing to expose the lighting where I want it to be. One of the great things about shooting at night is you've got a lot of color to play with. So normally in the daytime, when you've got sun hitting things, colors will pop. That sunlight bounces off a red wall or a green siding and it makes those colors bounce back. But at night, everything goes very flat. But fortunately, we've got man-made lights and there's lots of different colors in cities. So you've got like backlit posters and neons and hoarding that's up at night with different colored lights on it to protect you from going where you shouldn't, or bus adverts, and there's loads of different sorts of colors to look for. So the trick is to think about how can I use those colors to tell interesting stories, and you have to start by going, what are different colors make me think about? So what does blue make me think of, and how can I use blue to tell that story? Or what does red make me think of? What does it make me feel? Is it anger? Is it love? Is it hate? Is it something else? How can I use that with subjects in front of it that would make me think something about that color in that situation? And the other thing to think about at night is rain. Now tonight, there's nothing. It's very dry, it's a very clear night. But if it does start to rain, so many of us think, well, that's gonna get a bit miserable, I should probably go home. But actually it starts to get really magical when the rain hits. So don't use it as an opportunity to give up and go away. Look at what it's doing to the streets. If you think about a film, anytime that they're filming in a location, they will go through that set beforehand, especially if it's an outdoor street, and they will hose the whole street down. They call it a wet down. And that street becomes wet on the surface, on the pavements, on the road, on the tarmac, on the walls. And that means that every light that's in a scene is actually bouncing and reflecting around. So you double every light source in your scene with the reflections and the colors that it actually creates. So don't go home when that happens. When it rains, it might be about to get really good. Probably just jump into your local store somewhere, just a corner shop, get yourself a plastic bag and put your camera inside the plastic bag, poke a hole in the front and just push your lens through the front so you can protect your camera if it's not weather sealed. If it is, you could probably risk it a little bit and wait for that rain to settle in. Look at what puddles are reflecting and what the lights are doing and the fact that all those colors and lights are suddenly being bounced around all over the place. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, do I use a Pro Mist filter at night? And the answer is yes, I do. I don't use it for a lot of other sorts of photography. It doesn't work for me in daytime photography, for example, and certainly not for portraits. I don't like that very kind of soft, misty look for portraits. I like something a bit cleaner. But for nighttime, it's perfect. And I know they've become super trendy over the years because people like the glow it gives to the lights. But for me, it's a more deliberate purpose than that. It's for two reasons. One is because I want a smooth roll-off between the blown out whites of the actual light source itself and the first of the highlights, because one of the quirks of digital is you get often a very hard break point or a line between that blown out light, which you're never going to be able to expose for, and the first of the color or the highlights that roll off that as well. So it smooths that transition for me. And the second reason is that it slightly lifts the shadows, which gives a little bit more dynamic range back to the shot and helps with grading. The filter I use is the Tiffen Quarter Pro Mist filter. There's loads of different brands out there. I'm not necessarily, one over the other. You can look at reviews if you care about that stuff. So choose the brand you want. Quarter works well for me because I find that it's a good balance between an eighth, which doesn't do very much, and a half, which to me is just too strong. Everything starts to glow too much. But what a quarter does is it gives me something that feels to me like when you used to shoot film at night with something like Cinestill 800T, where it would actually bloom those highlights, and it gives about the same amount of bloom. So if I use this as an example in the background, you've got this eyes neon in the background. I'll show you a shot with the Pro Mist filter there. And then if I take the Pro Mist off, I'll shoot one without so you can see the difference it's actually making. You can see that with the Pro Mist filter on, it's smoothing out those highlights, especially the roll-off from the actual light source to the first of those highlights. But everything is still very crisp and very clean. And when you look at the one without, you can see that it's slightly harder digital edge to where that highlight is blown out to the first of those highlights. So that's why I really like to use it at night. It just gives that soft roll off, especially to my highlights. And there's this idea that if you use a Pro Mist, it softens the whole image, but if you actually zoom in on a Pro Mist image, you'll still see that there's a lot of detail in there. All your sharpness and micro contrast is maintained. It just helps you set the scene a little bit and control those lights. I suppose the last thing to mention is to make sure that you stay safe out at night, because you're going to be out in the streets with a camera that's probably quite expensive, or at least means a lot to you and isn't easy to replace, and you're going to be hyper-focusing on things looking for shots. So I would say try and stay as situationally aware around you as you possibly can, and I always wear a wrist strap, so someone can't come past and just grab this camera out of my hand. In London in particular at the moment, we're dealing with a lot of crime where we have electric bikes coming past and people will grab phones and grab cameras off you because people aren't aware enough. So stay aware, have a strap on you, make sure all the zips on your bag are closed properly so no one's taking anything out of your bag while you're shooting, and just stay aware of what's going on around you. And I know that some of you who are watching will say to me, well, even if I do that, it's not safe to shoot in my particular country. And I know what you mean. When I was in South Africa, I couldn't have taken an expensive camera out on the streets at night. It just wasn't worth the risk. So if you live in places like that, I'm sorry, stay safe. Maybe night photography is not for you. But if you feel you can go out safely, and maybe you need to take a friend with you to go out and make sure that you're staying safe, have that strap on, bag closed up, stay aware around you, and get the shots that you want to get. So I approach nighttime photography like I do daytime photography. I'm looking for those interesting pools of light. I'm exposing for the light, letting the shadows fall dark, playing with the colors that presents, looking for reflections if the surfaces are wet, and trying to work out what stories I can tell. I'm not necessarily trying to make everyone recognizable. I'm using shadow to make people anonymous and trying to tell interesting stories that feel like our cities at night. So if you're thinking during these winter months, I can't go out because it's just cloudy and cold and there's nothing to shoot, try going out at night. Give nighttime photography a go and see what you come up with. So I hope you found this video helpful, and this will be the last video that I'll make for this year, so I want to wish you all the best for the holiday season, and I will see you again in the new year. And just before I go, I want to remind you that there are still copies of my Parable magazines available. There are 4 editions out now, and each one features my own writing and photography around a different theme. And edition 5 will be out in January of 2025, so look out for that. There are physical copies available and digital copies. I will leave a link down below so you can go and check them out. And then lastly, thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode. If you need a new website or a domain, they're a fantastic option. I've used them myself as my website of choice for over a decade now. One of the biggest reasons I chose Squarespace for my website years ago, long before they were a sponsor on this channel, was because I wanted a very clean and minimalist website, but I had no idea how to put one together myself. With Squarespace, they had a very, very simple to use back end where I could just create my page structure and my navigation, and then just drag in images and text blocks and contact forms and galleries and video pages and whatever I wanted to see. But the design of those templates was so well put together by professional designers. It was very minimalist and it was in the background, and it was my work that was front and center doing the talking. It couldn't have been simpler. Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.